The truck comes in before the sun has decided whether it's going to show itself. A low, patient rumble under the coastal dark. Diesel breath hanging in the cool. Headlights sweeping the road like searchlights over a dry sea of chaparral and stone. You can smell the eucalyptus somewhere off to the side, sharp, medicinal, almost clean enough to be dishonest. And beneath it, the older scent, the honest one, dust that hasn't been kissed by rain in too long. A gate waits in the dark with its own private language, chain, padlock, a keypad that chirps and blinks like a small creature. The driver kills the lights, eases forward, tires whisper on gravel. There's a moment, always a moment, when the world holds its breath and asks a simple question. Whose water is this? Beyond the gate, the land rises in polite contours, kept that way by money and attention. Trees planted where trees did not used to stand. Grass coaxed into staying green through months when the hills around it go the color of old bone. A ranch, they call it. That word ranch is a spell Americans still believe in. It promises the old story, self-reliance, hard work, a man alone with his fence line and his conscience. But there's nothing solitary about the modern West, not when it comes to water, not when even the silence is engineered. The truck rolls deeper, past hedges trimmed into obedience, past a long driveway that curves like a question mark. Somewhere there are horses, maybe. Somewhere there are dogs, maybe. Somewhere there is a man who has been on television long enough that people feel they know him. They've watched him smile with that practiced ease, watched him ride, watched him stand in doorways and embody a kind of American steadiness that the country is always trying to talk itself into. But the driver doesn't care about that. The driver cares about weight and valves and the way the hose fights you when it's cold. He cares about the invoice tucked in a clipboard, a route written in block letters, a destination that, on paper, is nothing more than an address and an account number. Water doesn't care either. Water is older than celebrity and more faithful than law. Water goes where it is told until it can't, until the ground refuses to take it, until the people below start counting what's missing. The hose comes out like a thick, pale snake. Metal couplings clack. A gate on a storage tank gets swung open. The first surge hits with a sound that's both violent and comforting, like a river trying to remember itself. You can hear it in the dark, that steady fill, gallons becoming assurance. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler clicks and starts its slow rotation, the same rhythm as a metronome, as if time itself could be irrigated. And out beyond this private green, the public world is rationed. A neighborhood where people let their lawns die with a kind of grim pride. A city council meeting where men in ties say restrictions and mandatory and compliance as if those words can make clouds. A water district office lit by fluorescent hum, where a clerk runs numbers through a computer and sees a line item that doesn't sit right. Because in the drought years, those long, punishing stretches when reservoirs show their bathtub rings and the ground cracks open like old leather, every gallon has a shadow. Every gallon is a story. Every gallon has an owner, even when the owner is pretending it doesn't. They say the American West was built on courage. That's the legend. It makes for fine bronze statues and better school books. But the truth is colder and more transactional. The West was built on paperwork, on deeds and ditches, on handshakes backed by rifles and later by attorneys. It was built on the small, almost invisible shift from water as a gift to water as property. And because once you can own the thing that keeps everyone alive, you don't need to own them outright. You just need to stand between them and the stream. No, so here we are, in the quiet hour before morning, watching water move like contraband. Not stolen in the way a man steals a horse. No mask, no gallop, no gunfire. If there's theft here, it is the modern kind. Clerical, contractual, hidden inside the language of deliveries and accounts and authorized use. The kind that can be denied with a straight face because the denial itself is part of the machinery. The kind that only becomes scandal when somebody decides the numbers should mean something. And the numbers always mean something. They mean acres kept alive. They mean landscaping that can't survive on good intentions. They mean gallons per minute and days without rain. They mean a tanker that holds thousands of gallons, rolling through a state where people have learned to measure guilt in buckets. They mean the difference between a well that still draws and one that coughs up air. They mean profit, too, because the West is romantic only from a distance. Up close it is an economy, and water is the oldest currency it has. You can feel the moral fog that hangs around a place like this, because it's easy to make a villain out of a famous name. It's satisfying. It fits the shape of the story we like. The wealthy taking from the thirsty, the gates closing while the public dries out. But it's also easy to hide behind the complexity and call it an error, a misunderstanding, a contractor's mistake. The truth, more often than not, lives in the space between those two comforts. It lives in the way systems are designed, how 1,000 small decisions, each defensible on its own, add up to something that looks a lot like a crime when you finally step back. Listen to the water filling the tank. That sound is not just liquid. It is power. It is the ability to keep a certain kind of life going when the land is trying to shut it down. It is a private solution to a public crisis, and it is, in its own quiet way, a confession. This place cannot exist as it is without taking more than the land naturally gives. So the question isn't whether one ranch got more water than it should have. That's the surface, the headline, the easy moral. The deeper question is older and meaner and more American. In a country that sells the dream of private paradise, who pays when paradise needs to drink? And is that payment called a mistake? Or is it called the West? All right, Russ Daniels here, just man to man. I've been digging through the records and the drought-era math and trying to build this into a steady cadence. And if you want to make a calm little pact with me and hit subscribe, it don't cost a thing. And I gotta ask, why are you watching right now? Do you love ranches or something? They say it began with a man tired of Hollywood, a man who wanted nothing but fence posts and honest sweat. They say he bought himself a little patch of earth and disappeared into it like an old cowboy stepping off the map. It's a good story, clean, American, the kind of thing you can sell with a photograph. But the truth starts with real estate and money and a file folder thick enough to bend a desk. In September of 1988, late summer still hanging on in Ventura County, the kind of season where the mornings can feel like the ocean is breathing up through the canyons and the afternoons hit you like a door slammed shut. Tom Selleck bought a place in Hidden Valley, a pocket of land between Westlake Village and Malibu that looks pastoral until you understand what it costs to keep it that way. The papers called it a ranch because California loves that word. Ranch sounds like tradition. It sounds like dust and cattle and a man on a horse. But the property was, in the cold language of fact, an estate, roughly 60 acres, a Spanish colonial-style main house, originally built in the 1930s and later expanded 8 bedrooms, staff accommodations, stables and corrals, and a tack room, a swimming pool with a cabana, a tennis court, a 3-hole pitch and putt course, and a practice green, and tucked in there like a little wink to the century, a heliport. A ranch with a heliport. That's the part the myth always tries to step around. And the lineage of the place wasn't prairie grit. It was California glamour passed hand to hand like a high-dollar bottle. Singer Dean Martin had owned it before selling it in 1969 to car dealer Fletcher Jones for about $250,000. Nearly 20 years later, Selleck paid a little over $5 million. This was not a man stumbling into paradise. This was a purchase, a calculation, a deliberate acquisition made at the height of an 80s economy that taught Americans to think of land the way they thought of stocks, something that rises if you hold it long enough. If you want to understand the ranch, you have to understand the geography that cradles it. Ventura County sits where Southern California starts to pretend it's still wild. The Santa Monica Mountains lean west toward the ocean. The chaparral grows thick and resinous on the hillsides. Oak trees hold their ground in the folds and drainages, stubborn and slow, in the right light, especially in the early hours when the marine layer comes drifting in low and soft. Those hills look ancient, almost untouched. But look closer and you'll see the signatures of wealth. Long driveways, manicured paddocks, irrigated greens that don't match the surrounding brown. You'll see the quiet infrastructure, the pipes and valves and storage tanks that make the illusion possible. Hidden Valley, in particular, is the kind of place where the land is marketed as escape while it remains, in every practical sense, tethered to the metropolis. Close enough to Los Angeles to matter. Close enough to Malibu to smell the salt. Close enough to Thousand Oaks and the freeways and the corporate offices to remind you that even the pastoral is built on commuting distance. The myth says, out in the country. The reality says, strategically located. And even in 1988, the ranch wasn't just personal. It was family business with a Hollywood face on it. Selleck wasn't drifting into rural life with nothing but a dream. He was connected to real estate through his own circle. At the time, he was chairman of the board of a real estate development and management company, Selleck Properties, Inc., run day to day by his brother. His father, a real estate consultant, represented him in acquiring the Hidden Valley property. That's not scandal. That's not villainy. That's just America, family, capital, opportunity. But it matters because it tells you what this ranch really was from the beginning. Not merely a refuge, but an asset, a piece on the board. They had reasons, too. The papers in 1988 noted a child on the way. First baby expected in February. More room needed. A life shifting out of apartments and condos and television sound stages and into something with acreage and privacy and staff quarters. That's human. That's ordinary in its way. But the ranch was never the simple cabin-in-the-woods fantasy people like to attach to famous men. Even then, there were neighbors with names that carried weight. Developers, entertainers, politicians. Even then, the ranch sat inside a network of money and status, the same network the myth pretends he ran from. And then there's the other part of the origin story, the part that doesn't photograph as well. The ranch was previously a working avocado farm. Avocados, that soft green emblem of Southern California abundance. grown on trees that look almost tropical until you watch them fight through a dry wind. An avocado grove is not a casual hobby. It is an agreement you sign with thirst. People toss around thirsty like it's metaphor. But in agriculture, it is arithmetic. In winter, an avocado tree may need less than 10 gallons of water a day. In summer, it can climb as high as 50 gallons a day per tree, depending on heat, soil, wind, canopy, and how hard you want the fruit to push. Scaled out, that can mean something like 6,000 gallons per acre per week in the cool season and up to around 40,000 gallons per acre per week when summer comes in and sits down heavy. Those are not poetic numbers. Those are numbers that show up in pump schedules and invoices and the quiet panic of a dry year. Now, consider what you got. Roughly 60 acres in the hills, a property built and remodeled for comfort and privacy, and somewhere on that land, an agricultural footprint that wants water the way fire wants oxygen. You can romanticize it. You can call it working the land. You can imagine a man in boots making the rounds, planting trees, doing what he calls grunt work. And maybe he did. Maybe he does. But the deeper reality doesn't change. To run an estate like this in Southern California is to become, whether you admit it or not, a manager of a resource that everyone else is also desperate to manage. Because the late 1980s in California weren't some innocent pre-drought Eden. The state is a land of cycles, and water is always a gamble. Years of plenty followed by years of tightening. Even when the lawns are green, the future is written in the reservoir levels and the snowpack reports. When you buy acreage in that landscape, you're not just buying views, you're buying obligations. The land will ask, it will ask every week, every day. It will ask in gallons. And the myth, the famous myth, is that a ranch is freedom. You own it, so you're free. But the reality is that the ranch binds you to water districts, to imported supplies, to groundwater basins, to laws that were written because men once killed each other over streams. It binds you to crews who keep the place alive, the people who maintain irrigation lines, prune trees, repair pumps, haul manure, scrub algae out of tanks. A ranch is not one man. It is a small economy, and the bigger it is, the more invisible hands it takes to keep the myth standing upright. So when you hear Tom Selleck's ranch, you might picture a lone figure against a sunset, the old American silhouette. But the origin story is more clinical than that. A purchase in 1988, a price tag north of $5 million, a Spanish colonial house with 8 bedrooms and staff quarters, a heliport, equestrian facilities, a property once owned by Dean Martin, once traded for $250,000 in 1969, now folded into a new era of California wealth. And beneath it all, an agricultural inheritance, a grove whose quiet appetite for water would someday turn the romance into something much sharper. Was it an escape from the world, or was it simply a smarter address inside it? They say it began with a man tired of Hollywood, a man who wanted nothing but fence posts and honest sweat. They say he bought himself a little patch of earth and disappeared into it like an old cowboy stepping off the map. It's a good story. Clean. American. The kind of thing you can sell with a photograph. But the truth starts with real estate and money and a file folder thick enough to bend a desk. In September of 1988, late summer still hanging on in Ventura County, the kind of season where the mornings can feel like the ocean is breathing up through the canyons and the afternoons hit you like a door slammed shut. Tom Selleck, bought a place in Hidden Valley, a pocket of land between Westlake Village and Malibu that looks pastoral until you understand what it costs to keep it that way. The papers called it a ranch because California loves that word. Ranch sounds like tradition. It sounds like dust and cattle and a man on a horse. But the property was, in the cold language of fact, an estate. Roughly 60 acres. A Spanish colonial-style main house originally built in the 1930s and later expanded, 8 bedrooms, staff accommodations, stables and corrals, and a tack room, a swimming pool with a cabana, a tennis court, a 3-hole pitch and putt course, and a practice green, and tucked in there like a little wink to the century, a heliport. A ranch with a heliport. That's the part the myth always tries to step around. And the lineage of the place wasn't prairie grit. It was California glamour passed hand to hand like a high-dollar bottle. Singer Dean Martin had owned it before selling it in 1969 to car dealer Fletcher Jones for about $250,000. Nearly 20 years later, Selleck paid a little over $5 million. This was not a man stumbling into paradise. This was a purchase, a calculation. A deliberate acquisition made at the height of an 80s economy that taught Americans to think of land the way they thought of stocks, something that rises if you hold it long enough. If you want to understand the ranch, you have to understand the geography that cradles it. Ventura County sits where Southern California starts to pretend it's still wild. The Santa Monica Mountains lean west toward the ocean. The chaparral grows thick and resinous on the hillsides. Oak trees hold their ground in the folds and drainages, stubborn and slow, in the right light, especially in the early hours when the marine layer comes drifting in low and soft. Those hills look ancient, almost untouched. But look closer and you'll see the signatures of wealth, long driveways, manicured paddocks, irrigated greens that don't match the surrounding brown. You'll see the quiet infrastructure, the pipes and valves and storage tanks that make the illusion possible. Hidden Valley, in particular, is the kind of place where the land is marketed as escape while it remains, in every practical sense, tethered to the metropolis. Close enough to Los Angeles to matter. Close enough to Malibu to smell the salt. Close enough to Thousand Oaks and the freeways and the corporate offices to remind you that even the pastoral is built on commuting distance. The myth says out in the country. The reality says strategically located. And even in 1988, the ranch wasn't just personal. It was family business with a Hollywood face on it. Selleck wasn't drifting into rural life with nothing but a dream. He was connected to real estate through his own circle. At the time, he was chairman of the board of a real estate development and management company, Selleck Properties, Inc., run day to day by his brother. His father, a real estate consultant, represented him in acquiring the Hidden Valley property. That's not scandal. That's not villainy. That's just America, family capital, opportunity. But it matters because it tells you what this ranch really was from the beginning. Not merely a refuge, but an asset. A piece on the board. They had reasons, too. The papers in 1988 noted a child on the way. First baby expected in February. More room needed. A life shifting out of apartments and condos and television sound stages and into something with acreage and privacy and staff quarters. That's human. That's ordinary in its way. But the ranch was never the simple cabin in the woods fantasy people like to attach to famous men. Even then, there were neighbors with names that carried weight. Developers, entertainers, politicians. Even then, The ranch sat inside a network of money and status, the same network the myth pretends he ran from. And then there's the other part of the origin story, the part that doesn't photograph as well. The ranch was previously a working avocado farm. Avocados, that soft green emblem of Southern California abundance, grown on trees that look almost tropical until you watch them fight through a dry wind. An avocado grove is not a casual hobby. It is an agreement you sign with thirst. People toss around thirsty like it's metaphor. But in agriculture, it is arithmetic. In winter, an avocado tree may need less than 10 gallons of water a day. In summer, it can climb as high as 50 gallons a day per tree, depending on heat, soil, wind, canopy, and how hard you want the fruit to push. Scaled out, that can mean something like 6,000 gallons per acre per week in the cool season, and up to around 40,000 gallons per acre per week when summer comes in and sits down heavy. Those are not poetic numbers. Those are numbers that show up in pump schedules and invoices and the quiet panic of a dry year. Now, consider what you've got. Roughly 60 acres in the hills, a property built and remodeled for comfort and privacy, and somewhere on that land, an agricultural footprint that wants water the way fire wants oxygen. You can romanticize it. You can call it working the land. You can imagine a man in boots making the rounds, planting trees, doing what he calls grunt work. And maybe he did. Maybe he does. But the deeper reality doesn't change. To run an estate like this in Southern California is to become, whether you admit it or not, a manager of a resource that everyone else is also desperate to manage. Because the late 1980s in California weren't some innocent pre-drought Eden. The state is a land of cycles, and water is always a gamble. Years of plenty followed by years of tightening. Even when the lawns are green, the future is written in the reservoir levels and the snowpack reports. When you buy acreage in that landscape, you're not just buying views, you're buying obligations. The land will ask. It will ask every week, every day. It will ask in gallons. And the myth, the famous myth, is that a ranch is freedom. You own it, so you're free. But the reality is that the ranch binds you to water districts, to imported supplies, to groundwater basins, to laws that were written because men once killed each other over streams. It binds you to crews who keep the place alive, the people who maintain irrigation lines, prune trees, repair pumps, haul manure, scrub algae out of tanks. A ranch is not one man. It is a small economy. And the bigger it is, the more invisible hands it takes to keep the myth standing upright. So when you hear Tom Selleck's ranch, you might picture a lone figure against a sunset, the old American silhouette. But the origin story is more clinical than that. A purchase in 1988, a price tag north of $5 million, a Spanish colonial house with 8 bedrooms and staff quarters, a heliport, equestrian facilities, a property once owned by Dean Martin, once traded for $250,000 in 1969, now folded into a new era of California wealth, and, beneath it all, an agricultural inheritance, a grove, whose quiet appetite for water would someday turn the romance into something much sharper. Was it an escape from the world, or was it simply a smarter address inside it? They tell you water is simple, that it comes down out of the sky like a blessing and settles where it pleases, and that a man who owns the land owns whatever falls on it. It's a comforting myth. It fits the way Americans like to think. You buy the dirt, you buy the rain, you buy your peace. But out here, the rain is the smallest part of the story. The real water, The water that matters, the water that can be fought over without anybody ever raising their voice, lives on paper first. It lives in permits and priority dates and the old Latin of property law. It lives in ledgers, not in clouds. In the West, you don't really own water the way you own a hammer. You own the right to take it at a certain place in a certain amount for a certain use, if the system says you can. And that right, on paper, can outlive a man, outlive a drought, outlive the very stream it was meant to describe. The creek can go dry. The paperwork stays wet forever. California, especially, is a land where water rights stack up like old claims on a dead gold mine. Two doctrines, two different moralities, both pretending to be natural law. Along the rivers and the old stream beds, you've got riparian rights, born of English common law, where the right is tied to owning land that touches the water. You don't own the water itself. You own a kind of proximity privilege. You can use it, so long as it's reasonable, so long as you don't unreasonably injure other riparian owners. Reasonable. That word is a knife wrapped in velvet. Reasonable for whom, in what year, in what drought. Then there's the other doctrine, the one that smells like dust and hard luck, prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. In that system, you could be nowhere near a river and still claim its water if you were the first to put it to beneficial use. Dig the ditch, build the flume, divert it to a mine or a field, and now you've got a priority date like a brand on a steer. The older you date, the higher you stand when the water gets scarce. When shortages hit, junior rights get cut first. Senior rights keep drinking. It is brutal. It is elegant. It is the West explaining itself. Now put those two systems in the same state. Let them overlap for more than a century. Let them be enforced by districts and courts and boards and agencies, each with their own rules and political pressures. Let the population explode. Let cities rise where there used to be barley fields. Let agriculture scale up until it's no longer a way of life, but an industry. Then add drought, recurring, inevitable, indifferent, and you don't get a simple story about rain. You get a labyrinth. In 1914, California tried to impose some order on the chaos by requiring permits for new appropriations of surface water, what people call post-1914 rights. That date matters because anything claimed before 1914, so-called pre-1914 rights, often sits in a strange older realm, less tidy, sometimes less documented, more likely to end in argument. The state can regulate and administer permits going forward, but those older rights remain like ghosts in the foundation. A man with the right paperwork and the right priority date can claim a kind of seniority that feels hereditary, and in a way it is. Then in 1928, California's Constitution was amended to include what's now known as the Reasonable Use Doctrine, Article X, Section 2, declaring that water must be put to beneficial use to the fullest extent, and that waste or unreasonable use is prohibited. The language sounds moral. It sounds like the state finally found its conscience, but in practice it becomes another battlefield. Because the moment you say no unreasonable use, you invite the next question: who decides what's unreasonable? A judge? A district? A neighbor with a phone and a grievance? A newspaper headline? And for a long time, decades, groundwater lived in an even darker corner. Surface water had its permits and its paperwork. Groundwater, in many places, was treated like a private matter. You owned the land, you drilled the well, you pumped what you could. The invisible ocean under your feet became the last refuge of the desperate and the well-funded alike. During drought, when rivers shrink and allocations tighten, the pumps start running harder. It's not dramatic, no gunfire, just motors turning day and night, drawing down the basin one quiet foot at a time. In 2014, the state finally tried to drag groundwater into the same harsh light with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, requiring local agencies to develop plans to bring basins into sustainability over time. 2014 is not ancient history. Some of the men signing those plans are still in office. Some of the wells being measured are still dropping. The law exists because the old informal arrangement, everyone pumping as if the aquifer were infinite, was beginning to look like slow-motion suicide. Now all of this, the dates, the doctrines, the amendments, the acts, this is what I mean by paper water. Paper water is permission. It's priority. It's a right you can defend with attorneys instead of fists. And it's also sometimes a kind of mirage, because you can have rights on paper that exceed what nature can deliver in real life. Real water is simpler and crueler. Real water is the amount that actually exists in a given year. Real water is snowpack and runoff and reservoir storage and recharge. Real water is what's left after evaporation and seepage, and the basic needs of a living river. Real water is a creek reduced to a chain of puddles with minnows trapped in them, waiting for the sun to finish the job. Real water doesn't care who filed first. To anchor it in the language the system loves, 1 acre-foot. One of the West's favorite units is 325 to 151 gallons, enough in rough terms to cover an acre of land a foot deep. And that number, that clean, bureaucratic number, is how the West turns thirst into accounting. A district doesn't see a river the way a child sees a river. It sees acre-feet in and acre-feet out. It sees demand curves. It sees deficits. It sees delinquent accounts and penalties. It sees, above all, control. And once water becomes accounting, it becomes transferable. It becomes tradable. It becomes something you can move not just through pipes, but through contracts. It becomes something you can reassign, reroute, relabel, sometimes legally, sometimes ambiguously, sometimes, if the system is loose enough and the oversight tired enough, by slipping it through the seams between jurisdictions and hoping nobody notices the extra weight on the ledger. This is where the romance of the ranch begins to rot at the edges, because the ranch is sold as self-sufficiency. But the truth is, it's dependent on an immense web of public infrastructure and private rights. Even the most private water usually has a public shadow, a district meter, a permit, a basin plan, a utility easement, a rate schedule that gets argued at board meetings while everyone pretends it's just about budgets and not about survival. So when you stand at the edge of a green estate in a brown year, when you see irrigated turf holding its color like a lie, you're not really looking at grass. You're looking at the triumph of paperwork over weather. You're looking at a system where the right signature can matter more than the right season. And if water is first won on paper, if it is claimed, quantified, and defended in documents, then what does that make the ranch that depends on it? Is it still a piece of land with a man's name on it? Or is it a machine built out of valves and invoices that has to be fed no matter what the hills outside the gate are doing? They'll tell you the ranch is a view, a house on a rise, a line of trees, horses moving slow through morning fog. They'll tell you paradise is a thing you can buy once and then simply live inside. But paradise in Southern California is not a view. It's an operation. It's plumbing. It's a network of buried choices that never stop asking for more on a place like this. Something on the order of 60 acres, bought in 1988 for a little over $5 million, built up with the kind of amenities that don't apologize. You don't keep things alive with good intentions. You keep them alive with pressure and flow. You keep them alive with pumps that kick on in the coldest hours of the night, because that's when the air is still and the evaporation is lowest, when nobody's looking and nobody's complaining, and the water can move quietly into the ground like a secret. The work begins where no visitor ever looks, at the edge of the property where the utility line comes in, where the world's public water becomes your private water, a meter in a box. A backflow preventer with its stern little warning tags, valves that can be shut by men who don't know your name and don't care. The myth says the ranch is independent. The reality is it's leashed, and the leash is made of regulation and infrastructure. Even if there's a well, especially if there's a well, the ranch still doesn't float free. A well is just another mouth in the ground. It needs electricity. It needs a pump and a pressure tank and a maintenance schedule and someone who knows what a bearing sounds like when it's starting to go. It needs testing. It needs paperwork. It needs, above all, the aquifer to still be there when you flip the switch. People talk about wells like they're old frontier magic. Dig deep enough and you'll hit salvation. But groundwater is a bank account you can't see. And in the West, people have been living on overdraft for a long time. So the ranch builds redundancy the way a ship builds bulkheads, storage tanks, because you don't trust the line to always deliver when you need it. A property like this might have one tank tucked behind a stand of trees where the wind can't find it, 10,000 gallons, maybe 20,000, maybe more, depending on how the place was engineered and how serious the owners are about never seeing brown. Pumps to move that stored water back out again with enough pressure to feed sprinklers uphill. Filters, because a single piece of grit can turn a drip system into a silent failure that kills a row of trees one slow day at a time. And then the irrigation itself. People imagine hoses and sprinklers and simple things you can understand at a glance. But large estates don't run on hoses. They run on zones, dozens of them, sometime for turf, sometime for ornamental trees, sometime for hedges that serve no purpose but to make sure nobody sees in. Each zone has its own valve, its own schedule, its own demand. And once you have zones, you have controllers, little boxes with digital faces mounted in a utility room, programmed down to the minute. Water at 2:15 a.m. on Tuesday, water at 3:40 a.m. on Friday. Water for 12 minutes here, 7 minutes there, 30 minutes in the orchard if the wind's been hot and the leaves are starting to curl. This is where the American fantasy changes texture, because the ranch isn't just a man and his land, it's a crew. Somewhere, someone knows the map of the underground lines the way a surgeon knows veins. Someone has a wrench in their back pocket and mud on their knees. Someone is awake before dawn because a head broke overnight and flooded a swale, and if it runs long enough, it will look like a swamp, and the neighbors will notice, and the district will notice, and the narrative will change. And those people, those invisible people, rarely get written into the legend. The myth celebrates ownership. It does not celebrate maintenance. But maintenance is the real religion of wealth. The rich do not simply buy things. They buy the ability to keep them from decaying. A ranch with a former avocado footprint, an old grove, or even just the remnants of one, adds another layer of thirst. Avocados are not romantic. They are needy. They are a crop that punishes neglect. And even if the grove has been reduced, even if it's been replaced with ornamentals and grass and equestrian facilities, the land remembers what it was engineered to do: drink. Soil amended for agriculture, terracing, old lines that may still exist, capped or repurposed, the skeleton of a farm hiding under the skin of an estate. And then there's the hard unit that sits behind every argument about a little water, an acre-foot, 325,151 gallons. Enough to sound abstract until you picture a tanker truck and realize how many loads it takes to add up to 1 acre-foot. How many hoses? How many quiet nights? How many opportunities for a small error to become a big number? The public hears water and thinks of glasses and showers and maybe a lawn. But a place like this consumes water in the way a small town does, spread out, disguised by beauty, made palatable by the fact that it's not happening all at once. It happens in 1,000 small sips. The turf, the trees, the horses, the dust control on a driveway, the washing down of stalls, the pool that evaporates under a hot wind and has to be topped off again and again like an old lye being refreshed. And every piece of this system creates a paper trail. That's the part people forget. Paradise is not only built on plumbing, it is built on documentation. Service invoices, replacement parts, pump inspections, water bills, delivery tickets if water is hauled in, addresses and account numbers and district boundaries that look clean on a map, until you realize how easily clean lines can get smudged by human behavior. Because none of this is as romantic as the brochure version. A man can stand on his land and feel like he's escaped history, but the ranch is always in conversation with the modern world. The ranch answers to electricity rates. It answers to county permits. It answers to the rules written in 1928 about reasonable use, and the rules written in 2014 about groundwater sustainability, and the more immediate rules written by drought itself. You can only take what exists, and drought is the one auditor that never sleeps. It shows up without warning and stays longer than you can afford. It turns green into a provocation. It turns every sprinkler into a witness. It turns every gallon into a moral question. So you build your paradise with pipes and tanks and timers and redundancy, and you tell yourself it's just responsible stewardship. You tell yourself you're doing it right, doing it legally, doing it the way any prudent owner would. But what happens when the sky stops cooperating, when the drought years come in and the public world tightens its fist? What happens to a private paradise whose plumbing has been designed to forget scarcity exists? They say drought is an act of God, an old punishment, a test of character, a thing you endure the way you endure grief, quietly, with your head down, waiting on mercy from the sky. But the modern drought in California doesn't arrive like scripture. It arrives like paperwork. It arrives in a governor's voice on the evening news and a stamped notice sliding into a mailbox. It arrives in a board meeting under fluorescent lights where nobody says the word fear, but everybody can taste it. January 17th, 2014. Sacramento. The air cold enough to sharpen the edges of every sentence. The governor stands before microphones and declares a drought emergency, and the words travel south down through the state like a dry wind. Emergency, conservation, voluntary at first, always voluntary at first, because Americans like to believe they choose restraint. But even then the numbers are already ugly. Reservoirs drawn down, groundwater basins quietly bleeding, the Sierra snowpack thin as a rumor. Out in Ventura County, the morning still looks beautiful. That's the trap. The sun comes up over the hills like it always has. The marine layer rolls in and then burns off. The oaks stand there pretending nothing is wrong, but the wrongness is in what you can't see. The moisture missing from the soil profile, the wells that have to work harder, the little private pumps humming longer into the night. By 2015, the drought stops being a shared inconvenience and becomes a public morality play. April 1st, 2015, another announcement, another hardening. Executive Order B-2915, a mandated statewide reduction, 25% less potable urban water use compared with 2013 levels. 25%. Not a suggestion, not a slogan, a number with teeth, a number that means some people's habits have to die. And suddenly, the state is full of small enforcers. Not cops, not exactly. More like auditors of the ordinary. Water district staff in white trucks, driving slow through subdivisions, clipboards, tablets, cameras, men and women who never dreamed they'd spend their careers looking at sprinklers the way a detective looks at footprints. They learn the signs. Water running down gutters, waste you can see from a moving vehicle, overspray onto sidewalks. A misting system hissing at noon like a snake with nothing better to do. Hoses left unattended, pooling at the curb. The rules change from city to city. 2 days a week, sometimes one, sometimes bans on certain hours, but the spirit is the same. Stop pretending the faucet is infinite. And the public learns too, not the nuance, not the legal doctrines, just the mood. The bitterness that comes when you're asked to sacrifice and you suspect someone else isn't. In April of 2015, the snowpack in the Sierra Nevada is measured at roughly 5% of the April 1st average, so low it barely qualifies as snowpack at all. A season that should be a white bank account turns out nearly empty. That 5% number moves through the news like a threat. People repeat it to each other in grocery store lines, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. It doesn't. That's when the drought changes the way people look at green. A green lawn becomes a kind of argument. A bright hedge becomes a provocation. The sight of water, actual water, not a photograph, becomes intimate and offensive at the same time. A neighbor sees your sprinklers and thinks of their own brown yard, their own dying roses, their own kid being told not to play in the hose this summer. It doesn't take much for resentment to find a home. Resentment is drought's easiest crop. The enforcement mechanisms get clearer, harsher. State guidance and local ordinances start speaking the language of penalties. In some places, fines for waste can rise to hundreds of dollars. Numbers like $500 a day get tossed around, not as a threat from a man with a gun, but as a line item from an agency that has learned how to hurt you without touching you. Shutoffs, citations, public listings, the shame of being named as someone who didn't get the message, and the message is everywhere. Restaurant servers stop leaving water on the table unless you ask. Hotels tell guests to reuse towels as if cloth is what's draining the reservoirs. Yard signs go up, let it brown. People perform virtue the way they always do, out loud, with a little edge to it, because virtue feels better when it's seen. But behind the performance is real arithmetic. You can't cut 25% without consequences. In a small house, it means shorter showers, fewer loads of laundry, lawns allowed to die. In a landscape built for green, built for citrus and avocados and ornamental lawns that never belonged in this climate, it means a reordering of priorities. What stays alive, what doesn't. Now imagine you're sitting behind a gate. Not just any gate, one guarding a property that measures in acres instead of square feet. Roughly 60 acres, say, in a place like Hidden Valley. Acres of trees, acres of paddocks, acres of landscaping that weren't designed to look drought appropriate. Acres that have their own private logic. Keep it beautiful, keep it quiet, keep it separate from the world's panic. A property like that doesn't respond to drought the way a tract house does. It can't. Not without changing its identity. A small lawn can be sacrificed. An entire estate's aesthetic is an ecosystem built on expectation. It has irrigation zones programmed into controllers, lines buried under decomposed granite, storage tanks waiting like insurance policies. It has workers whose job is to keep the place from showing stress because stress is a kind of vulnerability. And wealth hates vulnerability. So the drought forces a choice that's never said out loud. Do you comply like everybody else and let the land go honest and brown? Or do you find ways, legal, gray, and visible, to keep the green? This is where the drought reveals what it really is. Not a shortage of rain, but a stress test for character and systems. Because the people with the least flexibility feel the rules first. They are the ones whose lawns die and whose gardens turn to dust and whose water bills spike anyway. The people with resources build buffers. They hire experts. They drill deeper. They buy storage. They negotiate. And all across the state, as restrictions tighten, a second economy grows. Quiet, practical, unromantic. Water haulers, tanker trucks, delivery schedules, a world of invoices and account numbers that exist because someone, somewhere, needs more water than the rules comfortably allow. By late summer of 2015, you could feel it in the conversations, this hunger to catch somebody, to prove the sacrifice wasn't one-sided, to find a name big enough to carry the public's anger, because drought isn't just scarcity. Drought is suspicion. It turns neighbors into accountants. It turns green lawns into evidence. And once a society starts looking at water that way, once gallons become morality and paperwork becomes motive, how long is it before somebody opens a spreadsheet, sees a number that doesn't belong, and decides it's time to ask questions? They'll tell you the drought made saints out of people, that the state tightened its belt and everybody followed along like a choir. Brown lawns, short showers, a new humility. But the truth is, the drought made accountants out of people. And once you turn a community into accountants, somebody always gets audited. It starts in an office that smells like burnt coffee and printer toner. A water district office, one of those beige buildings tucked off a boulevard where the landscaping is always just a little too green for the season. Inside, it's spreadsheets and rate schedules and a wall calendar with the holidays circled. It's the kind of place where your name doesn't matter. Your account number does. Outside, April 1st, 2015 has already happened. Executive Order B-2915, a mandated statewide 25% cut in potable urban use. The state telling everyone to do less with the same thirst. The public hears the number and thinks of dishwashers. The district hears the number and thinks of enforcement. They begin watching the system the way a banker watches withdrawals during a run. And then, somewhere in the routine, something doesn't sit right. Not a cinematic alarm, not a siren. More like a splinter under the skin. A report that doesn't match the map. A commercial water truck pulling water from a hydrant where it shouldn't, or pulling more often than makes sense. A pattern in the logs. Dates repeating, volumes consistent, roots that look too clean. The kind of thing you only notice if you've stared at enough ordinary numbers to know what ordinary looks like. Maybe it's a staffer in public works who sees the same truck twice in a week. Maybe it's a hydrant meter record that shows usage in the thousands of gallons again and again, while the neighborhood behind it is under restrictions. Maybe it's a complaint from a resident, somebody out walking a dog at 5:30 in the morning, watching a tanker fill in the dark, thinking, that can't be right. Not this year. Not now. The myth says a scandal begins with greed. The reality begins with procedure. The district starts asking questions the way institutions ask questions. Politely at first, like they're offering you a chance to explain yourself. They trace the truck to a company. They trace the deliveries to an address. The address isn't a tract home. It's acreage. It's a gate. It's a place you can't see from the road. And it belongs, this is the part that makes the story travel, to a famous name. A man with a face the country has borrowed for decades to mean decency. A 60-acre estate in Hidden Valley. The same place bought in September 1988 for a little over $5 million. A property the newspapers called a ranch because estate sounds like what it is. Now the district is in a bind that feels uniquely American. If the name were anonymous, the enforcement would be easy. A citation, a fine, a shutoff maybe. But fame bends the room. Fame makes every decision feel like it will be judged twice, once by the law and once by the public. So they document. They hire a private investigator because paperwork can be argued, but photographs have a different kind of weight. It's not romantic, a private investigator in a drought. It's not trench coats and whispered confessions. It's a man in a sun-bleached car with a long lens, sweating into his collar while he waits for a truck to show up. It's idling at curbside before dawn, listening to sprinklers clicking in the distance, watching a hydrant like it's a bank vault. The district later says the investigation cost about $22,000. Not a mythic sum, just enough to be painful. Enough that you can hear the board members saying, "We don't want to spend this, but we have to." Enough that, once spent, it demands a return in the form of action. They watch the hydrant, they watch the truck, they watch the hose connect, the couplings clank, the water surge in, they count, they write down license plates, they take time stamps. They take photographs of a commercial water truck filling from a public hydrant. Because the story at its core is that simple. Water leaving one jurisdiction and arriving in another. And the district's allegation hardens into language fit for court. They claim the truck filled more than a dozen times. 12 is the number that shows up like a nail in wood, and that the water was moved across district boundaries to the Hidden Valley property. They claim they sent cease and desist letters, because that's what institutions do before they swing the hammer. Letters sent to addresses tied to the owners. They claim the deliveries continued anyway. This is the part where the public imagines villainy and the lawyers imagine liability. Because taking water isn't just taking water. In a drought year, it becomes a kind of sacrilege. It becomes drought shaming. It becomes a story that feels good to tell because it has a clear shape. The haves watering their private Eden, while the have-nots watch their lawns die. The ranch becomes a symbol bigger than itself. The gallons become moral units. But inside the legal system, morality is translated into invoices. On July 7, 2015, the dispute arrives in Ventura County Superior Court, filed as a complaint by the Calagos Municipal Water District. The demand isn't for prison. It isn't for public flogging. It's for reimbursement. 21,685.55. The cost, they said, covered the water and the investigation. $21,000 and change. A number small enough to feel almost insulting next to the size of the property, yet large enough to carry the weight of principle. A number that says, we are not letting this pass. And then the story does what American stories do when you attach them to a celebrity. It escapes the local, it becomes national, it becomes a shorthand for drought, for privilege, for the quiet ways power moves through bureaucracy. Meanwhile, down at ground level, the people in the middle keep working. The truck driver who connects the hose and closes the valve, the contractor who takes the order and dispatches the load, the grounds crew who receives the water, who turns it into green by pushing it through drip lines into soil that can't hold moisture the way it used to, the invisible hands that keep the ranch from showing stress. And the famous man at the center becomes, in the public imagination, either a thief or a scapegoat, depending on who's telling it, depending on how badly they need the story to mean something. The truth, in a case like this, is rarely the clean satisfaction people want. A complaint is not a verdict. An allegation is not a confession. And yet the facts that are clear, the dates, the costs, the drought order, the 60 acres, the $22,000 investigation, the $21,685 fee by 5 demand. Those facts don't go away just because the story makes people uncomfortable. Because once the paperwork is filed and the name is printed, and the district has spent real money to prove what it claims it saw, the machine has to keep moving. The next step is never poetry. The next step is a room with chairs and closed doors and men who speak softly while they calculate risk. So, what was it? An honest mistake buried in contractor routes and district lines, or the beginning of a quiet settlement where the truth would be traded for a check and a promise signed in a back room? They say justice happens in a courtroom. They say truth stands up straight under oath and speaks plain, and the guilty walk out smaller than they went in. It's a good myth. It keeps the public calm. It makes law feel like a kind of weather, impartial, inevitable. But the truth, most times, is softer and meaner. The truth happens in conference rooms. The truth happens in phone calls nobody records. The truth happens in the thin space between what you can prove and what you can afford to fight about. By the time the Calagos Municipal Water District put its name on a complaint in Ventura County Superior Court, July 7, 2015, this thing had already turned into a math problem wearing a moral mask. $21,685.55. $21,685.55. That was the district's ask. The number they hung the whole story on, a neat sum that included water they said was taken, and the private investigation they said they had to pay for. Roughly $22,000 in watching and waiting and documenting. The cost of proving what your gut already believes. And behind that neatness, the bigger numbers stayed unspoken. A 60-acre property that could drink quietly all summer long in a state ordering people to cut back like penitents. Once the complaint is filed, the public imagines a clash of titans. They imagine a celebrity dragged into court, cameras outside, justice like theater. But lawsuits are mostly paperwork and fatigue. They are men in pressed shirts moving folders from one side of a desk to the other. They are calendars and deadlines. They are the slow grinding down of certainty into compromise. Somewhere in those first days after filing, the district side sits down and does what institutions always do. They measure risk. They ask themselves what it costs to keep going. Not in principle. Principle is for speeches. They ask what it costs in hours and legal fees and staff time, what it costs in the ugly possibility of losing, what it costs in the quiet humiliation of having your facts questioned in public. They have a board to answer to. They have ratepayers who already think the system is rigged. They have a drought hanging over everything like smoke. And on the other side, you've got a different kind of risk calculation. A famous name is an asset until it becomes a headline. Fame is a house you live in until somebody decides to throw stones at the windows. In a drought year, stones come easy. A celebrity doesn't just worry about the money. The money is manageable. He worries about the story attaching itself to him like burrs. He worries about what it does to the image people already keep in their heads. This decent man, this ranch man, this steady American silhouette. So the lawyers start talking. Not like enemies, like mechanics. They don't need to shout. They have the power to hurt each other without raising their voices. Picture the room where these things happen. It isn't grand. It's beige. It smells faintly of dry carpet and old coffee. There's a conference table scarred with tiny dents from decades of anxious pen taps. A pitcher of water sits sweating on a tray, an irony nobody mentions out loud because irony isn't billable. The air conditioning runs too cold, as if the building is trying to preserve itself. Someone has a legal pad open, yellow pages, blue ink, a list of numbers that looks like a prayer to accountants. The district's representatives come in carrying their legitimacy like a badge. They have binders, they have logs, they have whatever photographs and timestamps they believe are their spine. They have their demand, 21,685.55. They can tell themselves it isn't about the money because, in a sense, it isn't. It's about the message. If you don't enforce, you don't exist. If you let a famous man slip through, you might as well hang a sign over the door that says rules are optional if you can afford them. And then there's the other side. Counsel speaking in that steady, controlled tone that turns human mess into manageable language. They don't concede, not at first. They test the edges. They ask what exactly can be proven and by whom. They ask about jurisdiction lines, about contractors, about account numbers, about how water gets ordered and delivered and logged. They don't say mistake yet, but the word is already in the room, like a chair pulled back from the table. Because a case like this isn't a gunfight. It's a story about blame, and blame is a slippery animal. The water district can say, your ranch received this water. The ranch can say, we didn't authorize that. The contractor can say, we were told to deliver. Someone can say, a mix-up. Someone can say, a misunderstanding. The truth can be any of those, depending on how much you need it to be. And while they talk, the drought keeps going outside. The sun keeps coming up over hills that look older than any deed. Sprinklers keep clicking on in the dark. People in nearby neighborhoods keep watching their lawns die and telling themselves at least it means something. The state's emergency posture, executive order, B29-15, the mandated cuts, turns every private green thing into a public insult. That's the atmosphere this meeting breathes, the sense that everyone is already angry and all they need is a target. So the negotiation becomes a kind of triage. What can be resolved quickly? What can be paid? What can be said without admitting. The district wants its costs covered. The ranch wants the story to stop growing teeth. Neither side truly wants a long war because long wars are expensive and unpredictable, and drought-era politics are gasoline waiting for a match. This is where America shows its real face. We don't always solve conflict by declaring who is right. We solve it by deciding what we can tolerate. We solve it by buying down uncertainty. A settlement, when it comes, is not a moral verdict. It is a receipt. It says, we have weighed the cost of continued battle against the cost of ending the headline, and we choose the cheaper pain. Somebody signs. Somebody checks figures twice. A pen scratches across paper with a small, dry sound of inevitability. Hands are shaken with careful neutrality. No one smiles too wide, and then everyone goes back to their lives, carrying whatever version of the truth they can live with. But here's the thing. Even if you pay, even if you settle, even if you say nothing else, what remains is the system that allowed the question to exist in the first place. The maze of districts and contractors and hydrants and account numbers, the blurred edges where public water can be made to look private for just long enough. So was this a one-off embarrassment solved with a check and a signature? Or was it simply one visible leak in a whole landscape of loopholes built to make responsibility hard to pin down? They'll tell you, it takes a crook to steal water. A man in a dark truck with a fake mustache and a hose he bought off the books, they'll tell you it's the kind of crime you can spot by instinct, like rust on a gun barrel. But the West doesn't need crooks. The West builds systems so complicated that a man can do the wrong thing and call it a roading issue. The theft, if it happens in the seams, where one jurisdiction ends and another begins, where responsibility gets thin enough to tear. Start with a map, not the romantic kind with mountains shaded like watercolor, a utility map, lines like veins, district boundaries drawn clean as if water respects geometry. One side of the line belongs to one set of rates, one set of rules, one board of directors who swear they are protecting the public. Cross that line and the language changes, different billing, different enforcement, different authorized use. The land doesn't change, the hills don't change, but the paperwork does, and paperwork is what the West runs on. Now go back to those anchor dates that sit underneath everything like bedrock. 1914, when California began requiring permits for new appropriations of surface water. 1928, when Article X, Section 2 declared water must be put to reasonable and beneficial use. 2014, when the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act tried to pull the invisible aquifers into the daylight. April 1, 2015, when Executive Order B-2915 turned conservation from a civic virtue into a mandated reduction, 25% statewide from 2013 levels. Those dates aren't trivia. They're the spine. They're how the state tells you, this is not a wilderness anymore. This is a ledger. So picture a water hauling company on a drought summer morning. A dispatcher behind a desk, coffee gone cold, looking at a route sheet, names, addresses, quantities. The dispatcher doesn't think in poetry. The dispatcher thinks in jobs. Deliver here, then there, then swing by a fill point before lunch. On the other end of the line, a client wants water, not a little, not a garden hose's worth. Enough to matter, enough to keep green things alive on acreage. If the place is around 60 acres, if it has paddocks, landscaping, maybe remnants of agricultural use, then water isn't a luxury. It's a dependency. It's a system that has to be fed. Whether the owner is famous or anonymous, doesn't change the physics. It only changes the consequences. The fill point matters. In the world of hauled water, there are places you're allowed to take from. Designated stations, permitted hydrants, approved meters. Hydrants are everywhere, but permission isn't. In a drought year, permission gets stingier, more documented, more expensive. A hydrant with a meter is like a cash register attached to the street. Turn it on without authorization, and it's not just using water, it's taking. And taking becomes a crime the moment somebody writes it that way. This is how it can happen without anybody feeling like a villain. A driver pulls up before dawn, a quiet street. A hydrant standing there like it's always stood there. The driver has a wrench and a meter and a job order. The meter goes on. The valve turns. Water surges. The truck fills. The driver doesn't stand there thinking about 1928 constitutional amendments or 2015 executive orders. The driver thinks about time, about the next delivery, about getting the hose off without stripping the threads. The driver thinks, this is what I do for a living. Then the truck rolls. And here's the trick of district boundaries. You can cross them without ever noticing. You can drive 5 minutes and be in a different regulatory universe. The same pavement, the same sunlight, but a new set of rules. In a drought, those rules carry moral heat, because the people on the other side of that invisible line are being told to cut back, to let lawns go brown, to live with less. So if water is being pulled from one district's hydrant and delivered into another district's private reservoir, it feels like smuggling. Even if the driver calls it a delivery, that's the seam. Now, you add the human fog that always surrounds big properties. A ranch, or an estate called a ranch, doesn't operate on one person's hands. It operates on layers. A property manager, a ground supervisor, contractors who come and go. Somebody orders the water, somebody receives it. Somebody signs a ticket or nods at a driver and points toward a tank tucked behind trees. And when it's working, nobody thinks too hard about the chain of custody. Water arrives. Green persists. The place looks like itself. But in 2015, looking like yourself could become evidence. You remember those numbers that floated up out of the allegation like bones. More than a dozen fills, 12, the count that stuck, drawn from a hydrant. A private investigator hired, about $22,000 spent watching and documenting. A complaint filed on July 7, 2015. A demand written in hard ink, $21,685.55. That's the point where the seam becomes a rip, because an institution can tolerate ambiguity until it's forced to put its name on paper. Once a water district files in court, it's telling the public, we believe we have been wronged, and we're willing to spend money proving it. It's telling its own ratepayers, your restrictions mean something, and we will enforce them. It's telling every contractor and hauler in the region, we're watching the meters. And yet, the deeper truth is that this wasn't built by one man's greed. It was built by a structure that makes misdirection possible. Hundreds of districts and agencies, wholesale suppliers and retail distributors, public hydrants that can be fitted with meters, contractors operating in the gray zone between municipal infrastructure and private demand, regulations that change by jurisdiction, by season, by drought severity, enforcement that depends on staffing, budgets, political appetite. The system is a patchwork quilt stitched over a desert, and water will always find the loose thread. In that kind of landscape, the line between error and scheme is thin enough to slice a man's life open. One side says, a contractor took water from the wrong place. a mix-up in paperwork, an address entered wrong, a misunderstanding amplified by drought hysteria. The other side says, no, the paperwork was the point. The complexity was the cover. The district line wasn't crossed by accident. It was crossed because crossing it was useful. And then there's the third truth that sits behind both arguments. Even if the water was misrouted by a contractor, even if a celebrity never touched a valve or saw a hydrant, the ranch still benefited. The green still held. The private paradise still drank. So the question turns from mechanics into power, because complexity alone doesn't explain why the story mattered to the public. Plenty of people exploit systems quietly every day. This one caught fire because a famous name was attached to the gate, because celebrity turns a local dispute into a national parable, and because people starving for fairness will grab the nearest symbol and squeeze. In a system designed to let responsibility slide downhill past drivers, dispatchers, contractors, district lines, who finally wears the blame when the man behind the gate is famous enough that his innocence becomes a brand and his guilt becomes a headline. They'll tell you fame is just a light, something that follows you around, warms you when you want it, and can be stepped out of when you don't. They'll tell you a famous man can put on a baseball cap, drive out to the country, and become invisible again. But celebrity isn't a light. It's gravity. It bends rooms. It bends rules. It bends the way people speak to you, the way they hesitate, the way they choose their verbs. A water district is not supposed to care who you are. It's supposed to care how much you used, when you used it, and whether you paid. That's the myth of bureaucracy: cold, blind, equal. But a drought makes everything personal, and a famous name makes everything public. If the state can order a 25% cut in potable urban water use under Executive Order B-2915 on April 1st, 2015, then somebody, somewhere, is going to have to enforce it. And the moment enforcement touches a person whose face is known, the enforcement stops being routine and becomes narrative. You can feel it in the way a clerk's voice changes on the phone, in the way a supervisor wants to run it up the chain just a little farther than they would for anybody else, in the way people start thinking about headlines before they think about hydrants. A place like that ranch, about 60 acres in Hidden Valley, bought in September 1988 for a little over $5 million, doesn't just occupy land. It occupies imagination. It sits behind a gate, and yet it's in the public mind, because the man attached to it is a public figure. The ranch becomes a symbol in a way a normal property never does. It becomes an idea, the rich man's refuge, the old American romance with a new American bank account, and symbols don't get treated like ordinary accounts. When the allegation lands, those reported dozen-plus fills, that cost for the private investigator, the district's demand of $21,1085 $5 filed in court on July 7, 2015, the question inside the agency is not only what happened, the question is what happens to us if we're wrong, and then right beside it, what happens to us if we're right and we don't act. Because fame has a way of making everyone feel like they're on trial. Imagine the district office again, but now imagine the phone calls that come after the story starts circulating. A reporter asking for comment, another reporter, a producer, a blogger. Ratepayers calling in angry, demanding blood, demanding names, demanding that the district stop being weak. Then another set of calls, quieter, suggesting caution, suggesting restraint, suggesting that maybe everyone should slow down before they accuse a good man. That's how celebrity works. It recruits strangers into your defense without asking them. And in the middle of it all is the mundane truth that most famous people live inside. They do not manage their own systems. They outsource. They delegate. The ranch isn't run by a single man with a shovel. It's run by a small bureaucracy. Property managers, grounds crews, contractors, vendors, accountants. The very structure that keeps a large estate functioning also creates a buffer zone between the owner and the details. Orders get placed. Deliveries get accepted. Tickets get signed. The owner can plausibly say, and often truthfully say, "I didn't know." That plausible distance is part of the modern American nobility. Not a crown, not a title, but a layer of separation between you and the dirty parts of living. Someone else takes the calls. Someone else argues with the district. Someone else meets the truck at the tank and waves the driver in. Someone else becomes the first name on the blame ladder. But here's the harder truth. Distance doesn't change outcome. If the water arrives, the grass turns green. If the tank fills, the sprinklers keep clicking. The ranch benefits whether the owner touched the valve or not. And then there's the other thing, celebrity buys. Something more subtle than lawyers and managers. It buys hesitation in other people. A district employee who would slap an ordinary customer with a fine might pause when the account belongs to a famous person, not out of corruption necessarily, but out of instinct, out of self-preservation, out of the knowledge that a single wrong step could bring a spotlight onto their own name, their own career, their own family. The famous man can afford attention. The bureaucrat cannot. That imbalance is its own kind of power. So enforcement becomes a careful dance. Documentation gets thicker. Meetings become more formal. People start choosing words like they're defusing a bomb. Alleged. Reported. Under investigation. No further comment at this time. The language of institutions trying to protect themselves from both error and retaliation. And the famous person's side, because every famous person has a side, does what it always does in moments like this. It narrows the story, it frames it, it trims away the mess and replaces it with a clean line. Misunderstanding, contractor, mistake. It speaks in the passive voice, where responsibility goes to die. It treats outrage like weather that will pass if you don't feed it. Sometimes it works. Often it works. Because the public is tired. The public has a short attention span until something hits a nerve. And drought hits a nerve. Drought isn't abstract. Drought is a brown yard you stare at every morning like a personal failure. Drought is a dead tree you planted with your kid. Drought is a fine on your bill when you're already cutting corners. That's why this kind of story ignites. It is not just about water, it's about fairness. And fairness is the one resource Americans will fight over, even when they pretend they're too busy. The ranch, by sheer scale, is already an accusation. 60 acres in a region where most people live on fractions of one. A property that can absorb 55 hours like a rounding error. A place that can hire people to keep it green while others are told to let it go brown. Even if every gallon is legal, the optics are guilty. The drought makes sure of that. So now you've got two realities running side by side. On one track, the paperwork, the investigators, the district's demand, the legal posture, the careful language. On the other track, the emotional story, the public's hunger for a villain, the scent that there are two Californias, one that conserves because it must, and one that consumes because it can. And in between them sits the famous man, who may be innocent in the narrow sense and still culpable in the broad one. Because the broad one is about what his life represents, about what a 60-acre paradise means in a year when the state is ordering cuts and neighbors are counting sprinkler heads like sins. The royalty of the modern West doesn't wear a crown. It wears privacy. It wears plausible deniability. It wears a gate that keeps the world out and a name that makes the world listen anyway. But when a drought-strained public finally sees behind that gate, when they smell the wet grass on a dry wind and start adding up the numbers, how long before the anger stops being quiet and turns into something loud enough to shake the whole valley? They'll tell you blowback is a modern thing. Social media, outrage cycles, people yelling into their phones. They'll tell you it's noise. Here today, gone tomorrow, nothing that can touch a man behind a gate. But blowback in the West is older than electricity. It's what happens when people downstream realize someone upstream is still drinking. It doesn't start with a riot. It starts with a morning routine. A woman in Thousand Oaks, standing in her kitchen, the light coming in thin and gray through a window she hasn't cleaned in weeks because she's tired. A cup of coffee going cold in her hands while she scrolls. A headline, just a few words at first: water, drought, celebrity, ranch. She reads it once, then again, because her brain doesn't want to accept it. Outside, her front yard is the color of straw. She let it die on purpose. She did it because the state told her it mattered, because April 1st, 2015 came with that hard executive order, B 2915, the 25% cut compared to 2013, and the whole place turned into a church of sacrifice with no hymn book and plenty of judgment. Then she looks back at the screen. She looks at the numbers. The district's demand, $21,185.50. The private investigators cost about $20,000. The property everyone keeps calling a ranch, about 60 acres in Hidden Valley, a place she drives past sometimes on errands without ever seeing the house. She tries to picture 60 acres. Most people can't. 60 acres isn't a yard. It's a small world. She doesn't know what's true yet. That's not the point. The point is what the story feels like. It feels like the rules are for people like her. It feels like the drought is a tax on obedience. And the feeling spreads the way heat spreads across dry ground. Quietly, fast, inevitable. In the Water District office, the phone starts ringing in a different key. It's not just customers asking about bills anymore. It's anger. It's accusation. It's men who've never attended a board meeting suddenly demanding to know why the district allowed this, why it didn't catch it sooner, why the world always seems to have one set of rules for the gated and another set for everyone else. A receptionist writes messages on yellow slips until her hand cramps. A supervisor closes his office door not to hide, but to breathe. There are emails, hundreds, some of them thoughtful, most of them not. People want a face to pin it on, because drought turns the ordinary into evidence. A sprinkler becomes an insult. A green hedge becomes a confession. The public has been trained by restriction notices and patrol trucks and those little moral posters in restaurant bathrooms to look at water like it's contraband. So when they hear about tanker trucks and hydrants and deliveries, they don't hear nuance. They hear theft. They hear the sound of water running into a private tank while their own lives are being measured and limited. And the famous name in the story? does what famous names do to the public mind. It turns a local dispute into a national parable. People who don't know Ventura County from a map suddenly have an opinion. They don't need to know the district lines. They don't need to know how a hydrant meter works. They know what a ranch is supposed to mean. They know what a celebrity is supposed to have. They know in their bones how this country works. If you have enough money, the rules change shape around you. So the story becomes a kind of campfire. Only the fire is a screen, and the crowd is everywhere. Some defend him out of loyalty to the image. They say it's a contractor's mistake. They say he didn't know. They say this is just drought hysteria, dressed up as justice. They say the district is making an example out of a famous man because it knows the cameras will follow. Others don't care what he knew. They don't care if he ever turned a valve. They see the ranch itself as proof of guilt. They see a 60-acre spread in a brown year and think, even if it's legal, it's obscene. They see $21,785 and think that's pocket change. They see the whole thing as a reminder that scarcity isn't shared evenly, that some people live in a different climate than the rest of us, manufactured, irrigated, paid for, and in the middle of all that noise are the people whose names don't show up in headlines. The driver who filled the tanker, the dispatcher who sent him, the grounds crew who receives deliveries without asking where the water was born, the property manager who has to keep the place functioning while the outside world is sharpening knives, the district staff who have to enforce rules against neighbors one day and answer national reporters the next, all of them caught in a machine that doesn't care about their stress, a machine that requires someone to be responsible and doesn't mind if that someone is the easiest target. On July 7, 2015, when the complaint is filed, there's a certain kind of finality to it. Not a finality of truth, but a finality of escalation. The district has put its credibility on paper. It has said, in effect, we are willing to argue this in public. And the public hears that as permission to take sides. So the ranch, this place purchased in September 1988 for a little over $5 million, stops being land. It becomes a symbol of something rotten. It becomes a stand-in for every time someone felt played by a system they were told to trust. And symbols attract crowds. The blowback doesn't have to breach the gate to do damage. It can live in the air around the property like smoke. It can live in the way vendors talk when they think no one is listening. It can live in the way district staff approach any future anomaly with a little more suspicion and a little less patience. It can live in the way the owner's public image gets a hairline crack that never quite disappears. Because once people see you as part of the problem, you don't get to choose their memory. That's the hidden cost of drought scandals. They don't end when the paperwork ends. They settle into the community like sediment. And then the practical world asserts itself as it always does. Because you can't live indefinitely inside a headline. You can't keep a property alive on outrage. The grass will still need water or it will die. The trees will still drop leaves and demand care. The ranch will still be a machine that must be fed, only now every feeding is watched. So when the noise reaches its peak and the story starts to sour in people's mouths from overuse, what does survival look like for a private paradise that's been publicly accused? Does it double down and hide deeper? Or does it change its skin, rewrite its operations, and learn how to look righteous in a state that has learned to hate the color green? A man doesn't reinvent because he's enlightened. He reinvents because the old way starts costing too much. In the months after July 7th, 2015, after the complaint lands in Ventura County Superior Court and the number gets spoken out loud, 21 cent 85 as if that little string of digits could hold the weight of a drought. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a big property, not peace, not innocence, just a tightening, a sense that the world has moved closer to the gate and is listening now. On paper, the ranch is still the ranch. The deed doesn't change. The acreage doesn't shrink. It's still about 60 acres of California hillside dressed up as pastoral. The house still sits where it sits. The drive still curves the way it curves. The horses still need water, and the dust still rises off the road if you don't keep it tamped down. The air still tastes of eucalyptus on some mornings, and on others it tastes like sun-baked clay. But inside the operation, inside the part that never makes it into photographs, new rules start appearing like new scars. A clipboard gets a second line of signature. A delivery ticket gets photocopied instead of tossed on a desk. A property manager who used to approve things with a nod now wants account numbers written out, twice, slow. A contractor who once just did the job is suddenly being asked, where are you filling? Whose hydrant? What district? What meter? Not because anybody has suddenly fallen in love with compliance, but because the ranch has learned a lesson that every wealthy place eventually learns. Optics are a cost center. There is no romance in it. It's administration. You can imagine it in the way the day begins. Before the sun is fully up, the irrigation clocks are checked, those little digital controllers mounted in a utility room, blinking like patient insects. Someone scrolls through the zones. Someone adjusts minutes down, 12 to 10, 10 to 7, because every minute is gallons and every gallon now has a shadow. They schedule watering for the hours when the wind is lowest and the evaporation is least, not just because it's efficient, but because it's discreet. Midnight to dawn, the hours when the public isn't watching. They walk the lines, not a leisurely stroll, a hunt. They listen for the hiss that means a leak. They look for the wet patch and decomposed granite that shouldn't be wet. A broken head can dump hundreds of gallons before anyone notices. And in the post-drought, post-scandal world, waste isn't just waste. It's evidence. Somewhere out by the landscaping, a small brutality begins. The slow murder of turf. Grass is one of those lies people love because it looks like abundance. But in Southern California, it's borrowed. It belongs to wetter places. So the ranch, like thousands of other properties trying to survive the new moral weather, starts trading green for stone. Not all at once, not dramatically. In sections, one strip at a time. A lawn becomes mulch. Mulch becomes gravel. Gravel becomes a palette of drought-tolerant plantings with names that sound like apology. Sage, lavender, agave, plants that survive on less and advertise virtue without ever speaking. The work is loud up close. The scrape of shovels, the clatter of wheelbarrows, the low growl of a small machine peeling sod back like skin. But from the road, from the outside world, it reads as silence. It reads as responsible. It reads as a landowner doing his part. That's the trick. Reinvention is not only about saving water, it's about looking like you're saving water. And the numbers are still there, always there, even when nobody says them. An acre-foot is 325,151 gallons. A bureaucratic unit that sounds clean until you picture it as truckloads and hoses and midnight deliveries. The ranch doesn't need to think in acre feet to feel the pressure. It feels it in rate schedules, in restrictions, in the long aftertaste of Executive Order B-2915, the one from April 1st, 2015 that made conservation mandatory and turned water into a public test of character. So the ranch adapts like a living thing under threat. It grows new habits. It leans harder into efficiency. Drip lines instead of spray. Pressure regulators that keep mist from rising into the air like confession. Soil moisture sensors, maybe. Smart controllers that read weather forecasts and skip a cycle when the air has enough humidity to make watering look obscene. Not because technology is salvation, but because technology provides plausible deniability. If a neighbor complains, you can say the system decides. You can say the ranch is optimized. You can say, truthfully or not, that you're not wasting. And then there's the human side of reinvention, the part that doesn't come in a box. A meeting happens. It's not dramatic. A kitchen table, a home office, a conference room somewhere, people speaking in careful tones. A lawyer or two, a manager, someone whose job is image. They don't talk about right and wrong the way a preacher would. They talk about exposure. They talk about risk. They talk about how quickly a story can metastasize when it has the right ingredients. Drought, celebrity, a gate, and the suspicion that rules don't apply evenly. They ask, what's the simplest future? What's the least headline-prone way to keep the place running? That question changes a lot. It can change vendors, new contractors with cleaner paperwork. It can change routines. No more informal arrangements. No more vague instructions over the phone. It can change how water is sourced, pushing toward district-approved supplies, documented deliveries, systems that don't require anyone to explain why a truck was filling at a hydrant in the dark. And the people doing the work, the invisible workforce, feel the change immediately. They are the ones told to initial the forms. They are the ones told to photograph the meter reading. They are the ones who have to slow down in a job that used to be about speed, because now speed looks like carelessness, and carelessness looks like guilt. This is how the legacy survives, not by changing what it is, but by changing how it appears to operate. Because reinvention in America is rarely repentance. It's adaptation. It's the country's oldest skill. The same instinct that took the frontier from fur to cattle, from cattle to oil, from oil to real estate, always shifting the skin while keeping the hunger. And that hunger, in the West, always circles back to water, not as a moral issue, but as an asset, as security, as the thing you can't fake when the sky refuses to cooperate. So when a ranch learns to survive a scandal by tightening its paperwork, hardening its systems, and turning conservation into a form of armor, when it learns that the appearance of doing right can be as valuable as doing right, what comes next? Does the reinvention stop at efficiency and optics? Or does it become something colder, a new kind of frontier where water itself turns into the next form of wealth, the next quiet gold rush hiding inside a ledger? They say the gold rush ended when the last pan came up empty. They say the West learned its lesson, took the fever out of its blood, and settled into something like adulthood. They tell it like history is a straight line. But the West never stopped rushing. It just changed what it calls gold. In this country, you can watch the value of a thing rise the moment it becomes scarce. Not because scarcity is holy, because scarcity is profitable. And water, real water, not the kind promised on paper, is the cleanest scarcity the West has ever known. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't clink in a pocket. It simply decides whether a place lives the life it imagined or shrivels back into what it truly is. An acre-foot is 325,151 gallons. A bureaucratic unit, a clean number, the kind of thing a man can say without feeling anything. But translate it into the world, and you start to understand why the new rush is quiet. An acre-foot is the difference between a stand of trees surviving another August and dying on its feet. It's the difference between a pasture holding green long enough to keep horses from coughing dust and a property becoming a brown accusation. It's the difference between a developer selling country living and having to admit the country is dry and getting drier. That's where the money is now. Not in the cattle, not in the oil, in the assurance. In California, assurance has a legal backbone. 1914, when the state began requiring permits for new appropriations of surface water, an attempt to put a fence around chaos. 1928, when the Constitution was amended with the Reasonable Use Doctrine, Article X, Section 2, an attempt to make waste not just shameful, but unlawful. And then much later, 2014, when the state passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, dragging groundwater toward accountability like a reluctant animal being hauled into daylight. These dates aren't just history. They're leverage. They are the scaffolding for the modern deals. Because once you regulate something, you don't just protect it. You define it. You turn it into a category that can be measured, priced, and moved. You make it something a lawyer can argue over and a banker can underwrite. So picture the new gold rush not in a riverbed, but in a conference room. The room is always too cold, air-conditioned like a meat locker. The chairs are padded and uncomfortable in a way that feels intentional. A carafe of water sits on a side table, sweating through its glass a small irony nobody jokes about. People wear suits that cost more than a month's rent in the towns their water will come from. They don't speak of streams and wells like living things. They speak of supply reliability, of portfolio resilience, of risk exposure. Every word a way of avoiding the simplest truth: someone will get less so someone else can keep more. On the screen at the front of the room, a map, district boundaries, basin outlines, a patchwork of jurisdictions that looks almost beautiful when it's stripped of human suffering. The presenter points with a laser, red dot, sliding over dry counties like a predator's eye. He talks about SGMA timelines, about how certain basins will have to reach sustainability over the coming decades, about pumping restrictions that will tighten like a noose. He speaks as if this is natural evolution, but it's not. It's a forced reckoning with a century of overdraft. And in the audience, people take notes the way gamblers take notes at a track. Because when groundwater becomes regulated, the value of access goes up. If you're sitting on land with a secure allocation, if you got rights, infrastructure, storage, the ability to document your use and defend it, your property is no longer just land. It's a vault. It's a future. It's a place where scarcity can't reach you as easily. That's what the ranch was always flirting with, even before anyone accused anyone of anything. A 60-acre spread behind a gate is not valuable simply because it's pretty. It's valuable because it offers distance from the public world. And distance in a drought state is a commodity. The old economy of the West was muscle and risk. Cattle moved on hoof. Oil came up black and sudden. The new economy is paperwork and predictability. You don't just have water. You have documented water. You have a plan. You have redundancy, tanks, meters, approved fill points, an irrigation system that can be defended in public as efficient. You have the kind of records that let you say, we are compliant. And compliance in the new gold rush is insurance you can sell. That's why you see the strange marriage of moral language and capital language in drought country. Conservation becomes branding. Drought-tolerant landscaping becomes a signal, not just of responsibility, but of sophistication. A ranch that can say it's adjusted its irrigation schedules, replaced turf with native plantings, installed drip lines, monitored usage, whether out of guilt or out of fear, can now present itself as a model citizen. And in the market, model citizens command a premium. The story is not just about one famous property either. It's about what California has become. An economy where land values and water values braid together until you can't tell which one you're really buying. A place where the security of a water supply can add invisible weight to a deed the way oil adds weight to a pocket. And the conversion is relentless. Everything becomes a spreadsheet. A property bought in September 1988 for a little over $5 million. That's one era of value, when space and privacy and status were enough. Then comes the drought era, when a dispute over 21,685 or 55 can ignite national anger, not because that money matters, but because what it represents does. The idea that water can be routed, acquired, and explained away while ordinary people are told to let their lives dry out. That's how you get a new kind of frontier class. Not the men who can ride or shoot or work cattle from sunup to dark. The men and women who can navigate districts, rules, consultants, groundwater plans, and public optics. The ones who can afford to build systems that don't just use water, but justify it. And the invisible workforce stays invisible. The people who actually keep the valves turning, the lines repaired, the tanks clean, the invoices filed. They don't attend the conference in the cold room. They don't talk about resilience. They get told what the new plan is, and they execute it. And if something goes wrong, their names are closer to the ground and easier to step on. That's the new rush. Water as a financial story, scarcity as an asset, compliance as armor. But after the deals are discussed, after the landscaping is redone and the paperwork is tightened and the new gold is counted in acre feet and legal protections, what's left when the noise dies down and the headlines move on and you're alone again with the land and the quiet, and the bill still comes due every time the sky refuses to rain? After the cameras get bored, the land is still there. The story burns hot for a while, hot enough to make strangers feel righteous, hot enough to make a gate feel thin. Then it cools, the way all public fury cools, not because anything has been resolved in the human heart, because the next headline arrives, because people have jobs and children and bills and their own private droughts that don't make the news. The morning after that first burst of attention, the ranch wakes up the same way it always has. The hills don't care what the papers said. The oaks don't care what a water district filed. There's dew sometimes, thin, stingy dew that looks generous until you touch it and realize how little it is. There's the smell of manure in the stable air, warm and sweet and honest. There's a groundsman with a wrench and a cup of coffee that tastes like yesterday. There are irrigation clocks still blinking in their little boxes, indifferent as a heartbeat. On the public side, the district office keeps its hours. There's a woman at the front desk who has learned to answer the same question in 5 different tones. There's a manager who pretends he isn't tired of the word drought, even though he's been living inside it since January the 17th, 2014, when the state declared emergency and the whole mood of California shifted. There's a stack of mail, a stack of complaints, a stack of late notices. Bureaucracy is not dramatic. It is relentless. It's the sound of paper sliding across a counter, the click of a keyboard, the calm voice telling someone, "No, you cannot water on those days." Outside, the drought orders still have their aftertaste. People remember April 1st, 2015, Executive Order B-2915, the mandated 25% reduction, the sense that the state was finally saying out loud what everyone had been trying not to believe: this place has been living beyond its means. In the years that follow, even as the rains come and go in their uneven way, the memory stays. Californians learn a new reflex. They look at green and ask how much it costs. Not in dollars, in gallons. On the ranch, the lesson is quieter, and it doesn't announce itself as morality. It announces itself as procedure. A delivery is no longer just a delivery. It's a paper trail, a ticket with a timestamp, a signature, a photograph of a meter reading, a contractor's name written down twice, slow, like you're spelling something sacred. The ranch doesn't change because it suddenly loves restraint. It changes because attention is expensive. Because once a place has been accused, once a number like 21,785 has been printed in public, once a private investigation costing around $22,000 has been mentioned like proof, the smart move is to make sure you never give anybody that kind of purchase again. So the systems get tightened. Spray heads get replaced with drip. Timers get shifted deeper into the night. Turf gets cut back in sections. Small amputations that don't show from the road but change the whole demand curve. A lawn becomes mulch. Mulch becomes gravel. Gravel becomes drought-tolerant landscaping, a phrase that sounds like repentance but often means simply survival. And the people doing that work remain what they've always been, invisible. They are the ones who pull dead sod and haul it off, the ones who dig trenches for new lines, the ones who get up before dawn because that's when you can test a zone without eyes on you, the ones who are blamed first if something goes wrong because they are close enough to touch the valves and far enough from fame that no one will defend them in public. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from living under suspicion. Not the heroic exhaustion of hardship, the bureaucratic exhaustion of being watched. A property manager learns to speak carefully. A ground supervisor learns not to joke about water. Even the ranch animals, horses shifting in their stalls, troughs being refilled, begin to feel like part of a public argument. The ordinary becomes politicized. A hose is no longer a hose. It's a symbol. It's evidence waiting to be interpreted. Meanwhile, across the valley, in neighborhoods where the lawns were allowed to die, the resentment doesn't vanish. It just settles. A man driving home from work passes a stretch of greenery behind hedges and feels his jaw tighten without knowing why. A woman in a parking lot hears the word ranch and thinks of gates and privilege before she thinks of land. Drought makes long memories. It teaches people to store anger the way they store water, quietly for later. And time does what time does. It blurs the sharp edges without erasing the shape. The dates remain in the record. September 1988, the purchase of a Hidden Valley property about 60 acres, bought for a little over $5 million, a moment when California wealth could still pretend it was just lifestyle. July 7th, 2015, the filing in court, the dispute spoken aloud in public language, the sudden conversion of a private operation into a civic story. And in the background, the big structural dates that keep grinding forward. 2014, SGMA, the state telling groundwater it can no longer hide. 1928, Article X, Section 2, the word reasonable hanging over every use like a warning. 1914, the line drawn between the older wild claims and the newer regulated ones. Those dates don't care about a single ranch. They care about the West. And the West, in its quiet afterward, doesn't offer closure. It offers continuation. The sun still rises on dry hills. Wind still pulls moisture out of the air like a thief. District boundaries still cut the landscape into invisible fiefdoms. People still want more than the land can easily give. The machinery still runs. Invoices, meters, valves, pumps, penalties. The whole state still lives with one eye on the sky and the other on the ledger. So, you end up with something that looks like peace from a distance. The headlines fade, the arguments move on, the ranch stays behind its gate, the district keeps sending bills, the public goes back to ordinary life. But the question doesn't die. It just changes its posture. If a single drought scandal can make a community feel for a moment like it's looking into the truth of itself, if it can turn water into a mirror and make everyone see what they've been pretending not to see, then what does this story really tell us about America? A country that sells private paradise on public infrastructure and calls it freedom and asks the thirsty to accept it as normal. It comes back the same way it began, before dawn, when the world still looks honest because you can't see enough of it yet. A tanker truck idles in the coastal dark, diesel breath hanging low where the air is cold and damp and smells faintly of eucalyptus and dust. Headlights rake across a gate. The keypad chirps. A code is entered. The chain goes slack. The hinges give up their little complaint, and the truck eases forward, tires whispering on gravel like it's trying not to wake the valley. That's the West in miniature right there. Not the postcard West. The operational West. The West that runs on infrastructure and permission and the quiet ability to make scarcity somebody else's problem. They will argue about whether that water was stolen. They will argue it the way Americans argue everything now. Two camps, two stories, each one convinced the other is lying. One story says it was a clerical mistake, a contractor's routing issue, a chain of small errors in a system too complex for any single human mind to hold. The other story says, no, the complexity was the weapon, the paperwork, the disguise, the drought, the opportunity. And the truth? The truth is almost never polite enough to fit in either hand. Because the ranch is real. The gate is real. The land is real, about 60 acres of it, stitched into Hidden Valley like a private seam. Bought in September 1988 for a little over $5 million, when California still believed money could buy you out of nature if you paid enough. A house and stables and a life built to look like old American self-reliance, even as it depended on modern systems no cowboy ever dreamed of. The myth said rugged. The reality said managed. And then the drought came with its own hard dates like nails. January 17, 2014, the emergency declared April 1st, 2015, Executive Order B-29-15, the state demanding a 25% cut as if discipline could make weather. And the public obeyed the way the public always obeys when it's frightened and watched. Brown lawns, shorter showers, guilt turned into ritual. Then July 7th, 2015, a complaint filed, a number printed, 21,685, a little number that carried a big weight because it wasn't really about money. It was about meaning, about what it feels like to be told to sacrifice while someone behind a gate seems insulated from the same commandment. But if you stare at this long enough, the famous man at the center starts to blur into the background, and what comes forward is the machine. The machine is the water district with its maps and boundaries drawn like scripture. The machine is the hydrant and the meter and the invoice. The machine is the legal skeleton under everything, 1914 and permits, 1928 and reasonable use, 2014 and groundwater finally being dragged into accountability. The machine is the conversion of life into units. An acre-foot, 325 at 151 gallons. A number so clean, you can forget it's the difference between a tree living and dying. And then there's the other machine, the one nobody praises because nobody sees it. The invisible workforce. The driver with cold hands on a coupling, the dispatcher with a route sheet and a day that won't slow down. The grounds crew that keeps the place alive with shovels and valves and small repairs done before anyone else wakes. The district staff answering phones from angry ratepayers, trying to enforce rules in a state that wants fairness but hates inconvenience. These are the people who actually move water through the world, not the men whose names go on the mailbox, not the men whose faces go on the television. America loves the great man's story. We love to believe history is built by singular figures, strong hands, strong wills, the lone rider at the fence line. But history is mostly built by systems and labor and luck. Sometimes the great man is just the one who can afford to stand still while everybody else keeps working. So, what does this story tell us? If we strip it down to its bones, it tells us that the West never stopped being an extractive place. It just got better at hiding the extraction. It moved from rifles to regulations, from open ditch fights to closed-door negotiations, from taking land to taking the right to the thing that makes land usable. The frontier didn't vanish. It matured. It learned to wear a tie. It learned to say compliance and allocation and beneficial use, while it kept doing what it has always done, sorting winners from losers by access. And it tells us something else, something uncomfortable, that when scarcity arrives, morality becomes a luxury item. The people with the least room to maneuver are asked to prove their virtue with sacrifice. The people with buffers, money, land, lawyers, managers, are offered options. They can comply and advertise it, or they can adapt quietly and call it necessity. Either way, their lives keep their shape. Out beyond that gate, the hills roll away into the dark. The neighborhoods are quiet. A few porch lights glow like embers. Somewhere, a family is sleeping with a brown yard and an overdrawn patience. Somewhere, a water district employee is getting up early to check reports. Somewhere, a worker is already awake, already moving, because the property cannot pause just because the public is watching. And the tanker truck, this old plain machine, keeps rolling forward, deeper into the private green. The hose will be pulled, the valve will be turned, water will rush into a tank with that low, steady sound that comforts people who can afford to be comforted. If you pull back far enough, the ranch becomes a dot, the valley becomes a shape. California becomes a long, dry argument. The West becomes what it has always been, a place where survival is negotiated, and the negotiation is rarely equal. So when you remember that truck in the dark, headlights on gravel, gate opening, water moving unseen, what do you call the legacy it leaves behind? A harmless mistake, a tidy settlement, a necessary adaptation, or the quiet truth of how America still works?